Hi guys, good morning. Am I audible? Alafi, can you see my screen also? Is my screen visible for everyone? Please speak out and confirm. Guys, please confirm.
Yeah. So
Yes, sir.
yeah,
Yes, sir.
we are able to see.
Yes.
Good. Excellent. Right. Guys, all of you wish you happy Pongal.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, same to you, Ashok, and same to you and your family.
Thank you, sir.
Right. Coming to our session, yesterday we discussed about internals of run method. Right? Internals of run method in boot application. Okay, run method is important or it is not important?
Important.
Much important.
Important, sir.
Very important.
Very important. That is bootstrapping method in Spring Boot application. When we run the boot application, that execution will begin from main method. That means it is a start class method. So in the Spring Boot application, we have a start class. In the Spring Boot application, we will have a start class. That start class contains a main method. That is the entry point for boot application execution. Inside that main method, we are calling one predefined method called run method. Inside that method, we are calling
Run method.
run method. Run method. Okay, fine. So can anyone tell me what is happening inside the run method? As per yesterday's session, can anyone tell me what is happening inside the run method?
Stopwatch will be started.
Listeners
will start.
Suppose started and listener will call,
Preparing environment.
preparing environment, loading
Creating
the
application context.
creating application context, printing banner,
Printing banner. Preparing application context. Preparing context object. Then stopping the stopwatch. Then logs will be printed.
call the runner and return the IOC reference.
Return the
Log app execution time.
At last, the runners will be called, and the reference of IOC will be return type.
Based on the starter form, class from the class path, the particular web application type will be identified.
Inside the run method, what is happening? So first it is going to create the object for stopwatch. What is the purpose of that stopwatch object creation? That stopwatch is used to calculate how much time it is taking to complete bootstrapping process of our application. Now, after the stopwatch is created, then it is going to start the listeners. So those listeners are going to listen to the event and it is going to perform the operation. They load some classes which are required to run our application. After that, after the listeners are started, it is going to
Preparing environment.
It is going to prepare the environment. What do you mean by environment preparation?
Loading the
profiles. What are the profiles?
Loading the properties that are available in the properties file or in the YML file. Database properties may available, application properties may available. So what are the properties that are required to run our application, which we configured in the properties file? Those properties will be loaded and it will prepare the environment to run the project. Prepare the environment to run the project. Now, after environment preparation is completed, what is the next step it is going to do?
Print the banner.
Banner.
It's going to print the banner. What do you mean by printing the banner? What do you
Spring
mean by
Spring Boot logo
will be displayed in
showing,
the
sir.
system.
Yes, in the
Yeah.
console. On the console.
Spring Boot logo.
Spring Boot,
Spring
uh,
Boot
Console
logo
logo
print
will be
on the
printed
skull.
on the console? Spring
Yes.
logo will be printed on the console. That Spring logo is called as banner.
banner.
Now, can we customize that banner?
Yes.
Yes.
Sir.
Yes, sure.
Yes.
On and off mode. Yes.
Can we stop
we-
the banner?
Yes, sir.
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
Yes.
we can stop by
Have
the
a
Spring.
switch. We can stop or we can stop, we can disable or
We can customize. Yes.
a banner available in the Spring Boot. After banner is printed, what is the next step?
IOC container.
IOC container
Application context.
created.
Application
IOC
context.
container will be created. So in how many ways it is going to create the IOC container?
There are
Three
three
ways.
Three ways.
One way or is it three ways? It is going to create the IOC container.
Three
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 ways.
ways we can.
Create the IOC
One web
container.
application.
Reactive web application
It is
type.
going to create the IOC container in three ways.
Three ways.
Now, it is very important concept. How IOC container will be created in Spring Boot.
Based on the
First of all, who will create IOC container in the Spring framework? In the Spring framework, programmer has to create the IOC container. In Spring framework, programmer has to create the IOC container. When it comes to the Spring Boot, it is taking care of creating the IOC container. It is using different approaches to create the IOC container. So yesterday we have seen the framework logic in the Spring, whatever the logic is available that we have seen. Spring Boot is creating the IOC container based on the class path. Right now, IOC container will be created by Spring Boot as part of run method. IOC container will be created by Spring Boot as part of run method execution. As part of run method execution. Now, so IOC having, so Spring Boot is having three different approaches to create IOC container. Now, could you please tell me what are those three different approaches to create the IOC container?
Through select servlet, reactive,
Now,
and
first, Spring Boot will read our class path starters. Spring Boot will read our class path starters. So what type of starters it is going to check? It will check, do we have Spring Boot
starter.
WebFlux,
Webflux. Okay.
WebFlux, and what is the second starter it is going to check? Web starter.
Web starter. Spring Boot starter. Web.
Starter web. And another one, third one, that is by default one.
Spring Boot starter only.
Okay, if you have WebFlux starter, then this application comes under reactive application. This application comes under reactive application. When it comes to web starter, it comes under servlet application. It comes under servlet application. It comes under default application. None. That is nothing but default standalone application. So whenever you are creating a Spring Boot application, if you don't select any starter, by default this starter will come. That is Spring Boot starter. That represents a default boot application. That is standalone boot application. At the time of a project creation, if you have selected web starter, it comes under Spring Web MVC kind of thing. Dispatcher servlet, web servlet concept will be available. If you have selected WebFlux starter, then it comes under
reactive.
If you select WebFlux starter, then it comes under reactive. So now, for that, in the run method, for identifying what starter is available in the class path of the application, there is a method called deduce from class path. There is a method called deduce from class path. So where it is calling the deduce from class path method? The Spring application constructor. Guys, that is called inside the Spring application constructor. As part of Spring application class, predefined class, Spring application class constructor, it is calling one method called deduce from class path. It is calling one method called deduce from class path to identify what starter is available in class path. To identify what starter is available inside the class path. Based on the starter, boot will start IOC container. Boot will start IOC container by creating object for respective class. Okay, so yesterday we have seen what are the classes. Lengthy class names are available, sir. Lengthy class names are available. We can't even remember that name. One class name I have remembered, that is annotation config application context. It is going to use whenever we use a default starter. Okay, annotation config application context is the class it is using to start the IOC container. Now tell me, programmer is responsible to start the IOC container in the Spring Boot, or programmer is not responsible to start the IOC container in the Spring Boot?
Programmer is not
responsible for creating the
Programmer
IOC
is
container.
not responsible to start the IOC container in the Spring Boot. If the programmer is not responsible, then how IOC container will start in the Spring Boot?
based on
Boot only will take care of that. Boot only will take care of that. Do you know what is the code that is available in the boot to start the IOC container? Come on, please respond.
Yes, sir.
Do you know what is the code available to start the IOC container as part of the boot application execution? Yes, yesterday we have seen that code also. So where exactly it is calling that method to start the IOC container, where exactly that logic is available? Inside the run method, it is calling one method called create application context. How many ways it is going to create the application context?
3 ways.
Three ways.
So one is Webflux approach, second one is servlet approach, third one is the default. How it will understand, how it will create IOC container based on the class path starters. Based on the starter available in the class path, it is going to identify how to create that IOC container. Fine. Now, so with this we understood what is that application context and how it is creating in the boot application. What are runners in the Spring Boot? What are runners in the Spring Boot?
application runner, command line.
What are the runners in the Spring Boot?
Application runner and command line.
Application runner and command line runner. First of all, why we need these runners in the Spring Boot?
We execute
We want to
To load some predefined templates,
Runners
sir.
are used to execute the logic
One time,
only
at the time
one
of
time, only one time, once
the application
application
starts.
bootstrapping is completed. Once application bootstrapping is
completed.
What is the meaning of bootstrapping? Starting the IOC container, performing the
Starting
dependency injections, everything. Once everything is done, once application is started, then it is called bootstrapping is completed. Once the bootstrapping is completed, if you want to execute any logic only one time, once the bootstrapping is completed, if you want to execute any logic only one time, then you can go for runners in the Spring Boot. How many types of runners supported by Spring Boot?
Two types of
Runners it is going to support. First one is application runner. Second one is command line runner. First one is application runner and second one is the command line runner. Okay, very good. What is the return type of run method?
Context.
application.
What is the return type of Spring application dot run method?
Configurable.
What is the return type of Spring application dot run method?
IOC container.
Guys, please be active.
Configurable application.
Configurable application context, sir.
This is my
Configurable application context object.
sir. Today from morning onward, this is your first class, right? You are attending or second class, I think so. But it is my third class. I have more energy. I want that energy from you as well. I'm expecting that energy from you. Right now. So what is the return type of Spring application dot run method?
Configurable application context.
IOC container reference.
IOC container.
Run method is returning. Run method returns. Run method returns configurable application context. configurable application context. Can I say it is reference of the IOC container?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Run method returns configurable application context. It is reference of IOC container. Using this configurable application context, we can get the bean objects. Can I get the bean objects?
Yes.
Yes,
Can
sir.
I get the bean objects by using
Yeah.
this IOC container reference?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Using this
Using-
IOC reference, using this IOC reference, we can get the bean objects. Using this IOC reference, we can get the bean objects using getBean method.
Bean method.
What is the purpose of getBean method?
It will return the bean.
Return the
It will
bean
be
count
the bean
of
object.
If we are going to supply ID or type of the bean, then we are going to get that bean object, which is created by IOC container. Now tell me, what is a Spring Bean? What is Spring Bean? We are talking about bean objects, right? Bean objects. What is that? What do you mean by a Spring Bean?
Bean
The life of object is
The
maintained by Spring
Java
IOC
class
container.
whose life cycle is managed by IOC for any
Container.
Java class. If the life cycle is managed by the IOC container, then that is called as a Spring Bean. The class which is managed by IOC container is called as Spring Bean. So that class life cycle will be taken care by Spring Bean. Such kind of classes are called as such kind of class. If any class life cycle is managed by the IOC container, then that class is called as a Spring Bean. Okay, good, fine. Now, what is the start class in the Spring Boot? What is the start class in the Spring Boot? What is the start class in Spring Boot, guys?
Application.
Spring Boot application, sir.
The
Any
class which is used to start the boot application is called start class. Class name can be anything, sir. Class name can be application.java or it can be a demo.java. You can use any name for the class. There is no restriction. You can use any name for that class. But I'm asking, what is the purpose of
Class
start
containing main method.
I should improve my question. What is the purpose of start class in Spring Boot?
to bootstrap the Spring Boot application.
To bootstrap the application and
Run boot application. It is used to run boot application. It is entry point
for the application.
Entry point
for the application.
boot application. Boot application execution. Boot application execution.
Yeah.
Inside the start class, we will have
main
method. Java main method, public static void main, our favorite method. Right now, inside this start class, we will have main method. It will start. It will call which method?
Run method.
Spring application dot
Spring
run.
application dot run method. Run method performs. This run method performs Spring Boot application bootstrapping. What do you mean by bootstrapping? This run method performs Spring Boot application bootstrapping. Spring Boot application bootstrapping. Bootstrapping nothing but starting the project. Bootstrap nothing but starting the project. Are you guys comfortable with all these concepts now? Right. IOC container will be created by method execution. Spring Boot is having 3 different approaches to create the IOC container. So to create the IOC container, boot is going to read the starters which are available in the class path. If it encounters a starter webflux, then it will consider that project as a reactive application. For that one, class is available to start the IOC container. If it encounters web starter in the Spring Starter web in the class path, then it will use servlet mechanism to start that IOC container. There is one dedicated class to create the IOC container for second category of applications. If you don't select any starter at the time of boot application creation, then by default, this starter will come. It is considered as a default starter and it will use annotation config application context class to start the IOC container. Okay. Now, so how it is going to recognize what type of application we have created? So inside the constructor of the Spring application class, there is a one method called deduce from the class path. That method will scan our starters available in the class path, and it is going to decide which type of project we are going to create. We created already, right? Now, so after this, after IOC container started, it is going to prepare the context object. Then finally, it is going to call the runners in the Spring Boot. The main purpose of runners to execute any logic only one time once boot application bootstrapping is completed. Once boot application bootstrapping is completed, then these runners are going to execute. We can use two types of runners in the Spring Boot. First one is application runner and the second one is command line runner. If you have both in the project, then the preference will be first given to application runner. After execution of the application runner, then command line runner is going to execute. Good. Now, so what is the we are calling run method inside the main method of the start class. What is the return type of the run method? The run method is going to return configurable application context, that is reference of the IOC container. Can I use that reference to get the bean objects available in the IOC container? Yes, you can use that reference to get the bean objects available in the IOC container by using get bean method. Get bean method is used to get the bean object created by IOC container. What is this bean? What is a bean? Any Java class that is managing by IOC container can be called as a Spring Bean. Lifecycle taken care by Spring IOC container. Now, so what is the purpose of that start class in Spring Boot? What is the purpose of start class in the Spring Boot, guys?
Used to run boot
Run.
application.
It is
Our
used to
Spring Boot
run the boot
application.
application. It is
It is
entry
entry
point
point
for the
of our
boot
application execution. Inside start class, we have one
Inside,
method,
sir.
main
Right.
method.
Start class is the entry point for our boot application execution. Start class is the entry point for boot application execution. Inside the start class, we will have main method. It will call Spring application run method internally. That run method performs Spring Boot application bootstrapping and returns IOC container. Returns IOC reference. That's it. Are you guys comfortable with all these points?
Yes, sir.
Anything confusing for anyone?
No, sir.
If any questions you have, please, you can ask me now. Guys, I hope everybody is able to follow my voice and able to follow my explanation also.
Yes, sir.
I hope you are enjoying that.
Spring Bean instance our own customized class also.
Sorry?
Can you scroll down, please?
Yeah.
Spring Bean, the
Yeah.
class which is managed by IOC in the sense if we create our own class.
Yes, that will be managed by IOC container. Suppose if I create one user DAO, the DAO class will be managed by IOC container if you represent that as a Spring Bean.
Okay, like at component, at controller.
Yes, exactly. Stereotype annotations we have.
Okay.
Yeah, I will cover these annotations also, sir.
Okay.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Sir, Java Bean or Spring Bean entity Pojo, these four things are different or same?
Generally different, sir. Normal Java Bean, Pojos, these are normal Java classes. So Spring Bean, nothing but whatever the class you create with some business logic, that class, if you want IOC to manage, then you will represent that as a Spring Bean. Normal Java class, that means you have to create the object, you have to inject the dependents for that. But when it comes to the Spring, you no need to create the objects for your classes. IOC container will manage the objects creation and dependency management. Then it is called as a Spring Bean. So I will explain you how to represent a class as a Spring Bean, why to represent the class as a Spring Bean in the coming classes. Then you will get more clarity on that. Okay.
So Spring Boot will identify the starters or the particular classes to identify the web application type.
It will check the starters available in the class path, sir. Whenever application started, it is going to load the dependencies available in the pom.xml, right?
Yeah.
Whenever these dependencies are loaded, the jars will be added to the class path. Then it will read that class path.
Oh, okay.
It will read that class path.
Okay.
So class path means Maven dependency here.
Yep, dependencies we will add. Those dependencies will download the jars, right?
Yes, it will be downloaded and it will be saved in Maven dependency folder.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is called as a class path.
Yes. Any other questions, anyone?
सर आप इसके साथ प्रोजेक्ट लेने वाले हैं क्या?
Means?
जो हमारा स्प्रिंग विथ माइक्रो सर्विसेज है उसके साथ आप प्रोजेक्ट लेने वाले हैं क्या कोई?
Yes, project batch is going on right morning, 6 o'clock.
नहीं, इस सेपरेट क्लास के लिए नहीं लेंगे क्या आप?
Separate, we develop the mini projects here, sir. Simple projects, mini projects we will develop.
ओके ओके.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Tell me.
So this content is on email or group, sir?
Which content?
Yeah, sir. This notepad content today's.
Yeah, I will send it, sir. I will tell you the process. I will tell you. Tomorrow you will get it. Tomorrow.
Okay, okay. Okay, thank you, sir.
Right.
Hello, sir.
Yes,
Hello.
sir.
Sir, if you possible, listener example, sir. Any?
We will come to know that, sir. So once we start the applications, then I will tell you some of the listeners.
Okay, sir.
Sir, listeners, in the sense, component scanning, everything will be done at that stage.
I will come to the component scanning part, sir. I need to explain you one annotation, then I will give you the clarity.
Sure. Okay.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Spring Bean and Spring Component, both are similar or different?
Same. Spring component, nothing but a class that is called as a component. That class is called as a Spring Bean. Both are same. Okay. Good.
Yes.
All right.
Sir, one doubt, sir.
Yes.
You said the Spring Reactive SIP web like starter web and started simple application. Where we while we starting the application, where we mentioned, sir, this application is related to this.
But at the time of creating the project, you will select the starters. That starter will decide whether you are creating a web servlet application or you are creating a reactive application. Whenever you are creating a project, we will select the dependencies. As of now, I have not selected any dependency. So at the time of dependency selection, we will choose which starter you want to use for your project. If you don't select any starter, then it will come under this default starter. Got it?
Spring IO, we are anyone we have to select.
Sorry?
In time of Spring starter project, we have to select any one of these, no?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, thanks.
Sir?
Yes.
So when do we go for a WebFlex application?
WebFlex, if you want to go for asynchronous programming, sir. Now, in the RESTful services, I will cover that scenario when we will go for the WebFlex. Okay. Right. I want to make parallel execution. I want to call 2 REST APIs at a time parallelly without waiting for one response, without waiting for the response of one REST API. I want to make the another REST API call. Then we will go for that. We'll come to that scenario. Practical example I will give you for that. Where I am using WebFlex, I will give you.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Suppose if I have created this Spring Boot application by using Spring Starter and then downloaded the zip and open in the Maven, not the Maven, in the Eclipse. But later I want to add this RabbitMQ dependency. Then do I have to again, download the whole, from the Spring Boot Starter or inside Eclipse it is possible directly?
Can you come again?
I have created the project from the Spring Starter and imported.
Okay. You
I
created
want to add the RabbitMQ dependency. So to Yes.
You no need to create once again. You can just add the. You can take the dependency from Maven central repository and you can specify that in the pom.xml. Directly you can configure.
And then I mean, then the Spring Boot starter will take care of that. I mean, version conflict or not, right?
Yes, it will take care of it. You will just add it. It will take care of it.
Thank
Hello.
Yes.
Yes. Then we no need to add the dependency version for that.
Yeah, no need to add the version dependency, version number for the dependency. This will be taken care by boot.
Okay. And if any Spring means you are telling Spring Beam class will be managed by Spring container. If suppose any class, suppose our like getter setter class, they are not annotated with Spring annotations, so they will not be managed by Spring containers.
No. So if you want to manage your class by the IOC container, you need to represent your class as a Spring Bean, sir.
Then our helper classes like they will not be managed by Spring container.
If you want, then you have to represent as a bean. Otherwise, normal Java
Yes,
classes
yes,
it
yes.
won't manage.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. Good. All right. Fine. Next one. Guys, in the Spring Boot application start class, there is one annotation. Anybody remember what is the name of that annotation?
Annotation
At
Spring
the
Boot
Spring Boot
Spring Boot
application.
Spring application.
At the rate
Spring Boot application.
Spring Boot application. At the rate Spring Boot application. Okay. Good. Now, what is at Spring Boot application annotation? Anybody having idea what is this annotation?
It is a bootstrapping.
Sir, three annotation in involve, sir.
It is a combination of three annotations.
It's a combination of three annotations.
At enable
It
auto
will-
configuration, at component scan, and at the Spring Boot configuration.
Configuration, sir.
It will tells
Yes.
it will tells to the IOC container this is main class for main
This
main class.
annotation will be available at Spring Boot start class. This annotation will be available at Spring Boot start class. This one annotation is equal to below three annotations. This one annotation is equal to below three annotations. This one annotation is equal to below. Guys, Deepesh Agarwal, please keep your mic on mute, sir. Deepesh Agarwal, please keep your mic on mute. Now, so we are talking about what is Spring Boot application. What is Spring Boot application annotation? Now, this Spring Boot application annotation will be available at start class of the Spring Boot, and this one annotation is equal to below three annotations. Anybody know what are those three annotations?
Spring Boot configuration.
At the rate component scan.
Component scan and Spring Boot
configuration.
enable.
At the enable auto configuration.
Auto configuration. Enable auto configuration.
Component scan.
Component scan.
Component scan. Component scan.
Component scan.
At component scan. Instead of writing three annotations, they provided one annotation which is equal to these three annotations. So at Spring Boot application annotation is available at Spring Boot. This annotation is equal to below three annotations. First one is at boot configuration, and enable configuration, and at component scan. Now let's look at this. Go to start class of the Spring Boot. Ashok, how can you say that one annotation is equal to three annotations? Just to open source code of that annotation. Just open source code of that annotation. So press Control in your keyboard and keep mouse cursor on this annotation. It is highlighting in the blue color. That means source code is attached for this. You can see the source code also. Now open it. Click on it. That annotation is opened. So first let us read some description what they have provided. Yeah. Yeah. Guys, please read this. Java documentation for that annotation.
Indicates
Guys, completed?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Tell me what you understood. Tell me what you understood from that.
This one Spring Boot application is equals to this equivalent of these three annotation: component scan, enable auto configuration, and direct Spring Boot configuration.
Indicates configuration class that declares one or more bean methods and also triggers enable auto configuration and component scanning. That means it is doing a lot of things in the background. This class indicating as a configuration class. Inside this class, you can declare a bean. Inside this class, you can declare a bean. One or more bean methods we can declare, and it is going to trigger auto configuration. This is a convenience annotation that is equivalent to declaring at configuration, at enable auto configuration, at component scan. That means instead of writing three annotations separately, we can go with this one annotation. We can go with this one annotation, and it is going to provide a lot of things for us. Now, so first one, Spring Boot start class is equal to a configuration class. Generally, how we will represent a Java class as a configuration class in the Spring? By using add configuration annotation. By using add configuration annotation. Now, instead of we are writing add configuration, that is already part of that. That means as our start class containing at boot application, so that is equivalent to add configuration. That is equivalent to add configuration. And second one, it is going to enable auto configuration. So what is the meaning of auto configuration, guys? What is the meaning of auto configuration?
Identifying that
Spring Boot identify the classes
Which
which is
type
required
of
to run our
mechanism is
application.
required to run the Spring Boot application?
What configuration is required for our application will be identified and will provide that configuration in the runtime for our application. Suppose if I need a starter, then boot will provide the starter. If I need a database, boot will provide the database for me. Okay, if I want IOC container, boot will provide the IOC container for me. So whatever is required to run my application, boot is going to identify that, and boot is going to provide me that configuration. Boot is going to identify that, and boot is going to provide me that configuration. Okay, we'll talk about it. We'll talk more about it. Now, component scanning. Anybody having idea about what is component scanning? Anybody have idea what is component scanning?
It will scan the entire
And all the classes of our package, sir.
Component scanning is the process of identifying which classes are Spring Beans in our application, which classes are represented as Spring Beans in our application, and which classes are not represented as Spring Beans in our application. Now, in my project, I'm creating 100 classes. Some are the controllers, some are the service classes, some are the classes are DAOs, some classes are entities, some classes are only POJOs, right? Now, if I have 100 classes in the project, do we want all the 100 classes should be managed by IOC, or we want only business classes to be managed by IOC?
Only business classes.
Only business classes.
Classes we need to manage by IOC container. So we need to differentiate which is a normal Java class and which is a Spring Bean class. Okay, for that we have some annotations: at component, at service, at repository, controller, REST controller, bean method, like that. There are some stereotype annotations are available to represent our Java class as a Spring Bean. Now, so in my project, some classes are normal Java classes. Some classes should be represented as a Spring Beans. Okay, as a programmer, when I look at the class, I can understand. Hey, this is a normal Java class or Spring Bean class. because annotation will be available. If that annotation is presented, then it is a Spring Bean class. If annotation is not presented, it is normal Java class. It is a normal Java class. Okay. Now, but how that Spring Boot will understand? How that Spring Boot will understand which classes are Spring Beans, which are normal Java classes? For that, it is going to use component scanning process. It is going to use component scanning process. As part of that component scanning process, it will identify which classes are declared as a Spring Beans, and it is going to load those classes, and it is going to perform dependency injection for those classes. It is going to load those classes, and it is going to perform dependency injection for those classes. Okay, right now. So guys, did you get the basic idea? What is component scanning? It is process of recognizing Spring Bean classes available in the application. Can anybody tell me what is component scanning? Can anybody tell me what is component scanning, guys?
It is a process of
identifying Spring Bean classes in our
it
application.
will identify the
Yes.
Spring Bean classes and it will
It is
do
the
the
process of
dependency injection.
It is the process of identify the
Yep, it is
stack
the
of
process of identifying Spring Bean classes
Spring Bean
which are
classes
available
and
in the application. Okay, now what is auto configuration?
To identify the components which are
Automatically
required for our
identifying the
configuration is
required
required to run
Spring Boot
our Spring
application.
Boot application.
It is going to identify the configuration
configuration
which is
which is
required
needed
to run our application.
for our application.
Which is going to identify the configuration that is required for our application, and it is
Needed
going
to our
to
application.
provide that configuration for us.
Configuration.
And it is going to provide that configuration for us. Got my point?
Yes.
Got my point? All right. Now, first, Spring Boot auto configuration annotation representing our class as a configuration class. Spring Boot configuration annotation is equal to yet configuration annotation available in the Spring framework. It represents our class as configuration class. It represents our class as configuration class. What is the meaning of configuration class? You can write some methods as beans. You can declare some bean class method, bean methods here to create the object of the IOC container. Any suppose I want to represent a data source. I want to represent Redis cache. Right? I want to represent some properties. I want to create the object on my own, and I want to represent that as a Spring Bean. Such kind of methods you can write inside this configuration class. If you want to customize the configuration of your application, then you can declare your class as a configuration class by using @configuration annotation. Now, going forward, we are going to talk about one annotation called @bean annotation. Then you will get the more clarity. What is this configuration class? Okay, configuration. If you want to do example, Kafka configuration, Kafka config, data source config, Swagger config, REST template config, etc. These kind of configurations we are going to do. Redis config. These kind of configurations we are going to do in our Java class by using @configuration annotation. But here we no need to use @configuration annotation because by default this annotation is available. It is equal to configuration annotation. So if you want to do any configuration in your application, you can directly do that in the Spring Boot start class, because Spring Boot start class is equivalent to one configuration class. How can I say this class is equivalent to one configuration class? Because of this annotation. It is containing this annotation. It contains this annotation. That annotation is equal to configuration annotation. Next one, auto configuration. Yes, right. Auto configuration is the process of identifying auto configuration. Enable auto configuration. Enable auto configuration identifies the configuration which is required to run our application. Enable auto configuration identifies the configuration which is required to run our application and will provide that. and will provide that. Now, guys, if I want to run my web application, do we need dispatcher servlet or we don't need the dispatcher servlet?
We need dispatcher servlet.
Do we need the dispatcher servlet or we don't need the dispatcher servlet? We need the dispatcher servlet. Now, do I need to start the dispatcher servlet or Spring Boot has to start it?
Spring Boot has to start it.
Spring Boot will start. Whenever I start a web, whenever I am running web application, that should be deployed to a server or no need to be deployed to a server.
Should be deployed to
No
the
need to deploy on server.
Generally, whenever we develop a web application, do we need to deploy that application to a server or no need to deploy that application to a server?
We need to deploy.
We need to deploy.
We need to deploy the application to a server. That is general manual process. But when it comes to the Spring Boot, Boot is intelligent or not?
Intelligent.
Boot is intelligent. Boot is intelligent. It have that sense. Boot is having that sense. Hey, this person is running a web application. That means that application should be deployed to a server. That application should be deployed to a server. Okay. Now that is called auto configuration. And one more thing. In our boot application, we have a .properties file to configure the properties in the form of key and value. If you configure data source properties like driver class URL, username, password, what does that mean? If you configure
Configure the database. Yes.
Database for our project, right? You are going to interact with the database. So to interact with the database, connection is required or connection is not required?
connection required.
Connection is required. Now, generally, when you go for JDBC, so JDBC API will open the connection automatically, or you need to call driver manager.get connection method.
Call
automatically.
We have to call that method to begin a connection or to open a connection. But when it comes to the Spring Boot, if you add those data source properties in the application or properties file, it will create the connection pool for you. Are you able to understand? If you add data source properties in the properties file, when the properties are loaded, Boot will create the connection pool for you. Why it is creating a connection pool? It is proactive. It is proactive. Boot is proactive because when the programmer configures the data source properties, it is thinking like this. Boot is having a brain. It is thinking like this. Hey, this person added data source properties. That means he's going to communicate with the database. To communicate with the database, connections are required. Let me create the connection pool. That is how it is going to think. You have seen the Robo movie, Chitty.
Chitty, yeah.
It is intelligent or not?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
It is intelligent. It is intelligent. But at the end, he became. Right. He became viral. But here, Boot is intelligent here. What is required for you? It is going to provide that. It is going to guess the configuration which is required for you. That is called auto configuration in the Spring Boot. Sir, how Boot will understand what is required for me?
Based on the dependency.
Based on your starters only. Starters will play the major role in the Spring Boot, guys. Based on the starters only, suppose if you don't add a web starter, will it start the server for you?
No.
If you have a web starter, then only it is going to start the server for you. If I don't now, in my application, do I have a web starter or I don't have a web starter?
We don't have web starter.
Server is starting or server is not starting?
Server is not starting.
Server is not starting.
Not starting. Why it is not starting?
Because we don't have web starter
web application.
We are not a web starter here.
It is not a web application. It is not a web application. So server is not required for this. Server is not required
for this.
If you have a web starter,
then server
will be required.
And
it will deploy.
Server is required. Application should be deployed. A lot of things are there. Right now, based on the starters only, it is going to guess. Based on the starters only, it is going to guess what is required for our application. Good. Now, and one more thing, guys. Go to your project Maven dependencies. Go to your project Maven dependencies. Here, you can see one starter called Spring Boot Auto Configure. Can you see a jar with a name called Boot Auto Configure?
Yes, sir.
Boot Auto Configure. Expand this jar. So many packages are there. So many packages are there in that jar file. Scroll it down. At the end, you can see one folder called meta-inf. Go inside that. Inside that meta-inf folder, you can see one file called spring.factories. Okay, spring.factories. So what are the classes that are required for your application? It is already configured here. Are you able to understand? Okay, what is the auto configuration? What kind of classes that might required for your application? Which classes it has to load by default? They are already configured here. Fully qualified class names, they are already configured. So based on this spring.factories file, it is going to load the configuration which is required for your project. So when you have some free time, just go through the spring.factories file. You will understand that. Okay, you just may contain the class names. Next. So we are clear with what is boot configuration annotation, and we are clear with what is auto configuration annotation, right? What is boot configuration annotation, guys?
It is equivalent to what configuration?
Equal to enter configuration present spring framework.
Class as configuration class.
It is equivalent to configuration class. It is equivalent to configuration.
Configuration class.
Right. Now, here, what is enable auto configuration annotation?
Identify
Identifies
configuration
the classes which to run our application.
and it will provide that.
Identify the requirement of application.
What are the components that are required to run our application will be identified here, and it is going to provide those things for our application in the runtime. Next, component scanning. Component scanning. Right now, at component scan annotation. At component scan annotation enables component scanning for our application. Component scanning for our application. It is the process of recognizing. It is the process of recognizing Spring Bean classes available in the application. It is the process of recognizing Spring Bean classes available in our application. Now, our application may contain 100 classes. 100 classes are you going to create in the single package, or you are going to create in the different packages?
Different packages.
We are going to create them in the different packages. Component scanning will go to those packages, and it is going to component scanning is going to check which classes are represented as Spring Beans, and it is going to load those classes, and it is going to perform dependency injection for those classes. Is going to perform dependency injection also for those classes. Now, so component scanning requires 1 more hour to understand. Practically, I am going to show you how that component scanning is going to work in the Spring Boot. So today we can't complete that. In the next session, we are going to, we are going to understand how internally component scanning is working, what is base package naming convention in the Spring Boot, what is the purpose of base package naming convention, how to load the classes from the different packages. Those things we are going to discuss in the next session. Yes. Before going to wind off, anybody having any questions for today?
Hello, sir.
Yes.
Sir, ideal place for configuration is starter class in a real-time scenario, right?
You can use that start class, or you can create a separate class. You can represent that class as a configuration also.
So there will be, I mean, most of the time only one class for configuration, right?
Yes, generally. For Kafka configuration we will create. For REST template configuration we will create. For security separate classes we are going to create, which will improve the readability of that. So generally in my project, suppose for Kafka configuration we are creating a separate class. For Swagger we are creating a separate class. For security we are creating separate class. Like that, we'll maintain.
Sir, on the top of the class, we will write at configuration or at Spring Boot configuration for each
Anything, at configuration only we will write it.
So, but we can write anything, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Sir, what is the basic difference between like enable auto configuration and Spring Boot configuration?
Spring Boot configuration, whatever you write in your class, it is going to load it as a normal user-defined configuration class. Auto configuration, nothing but predefined components it will load to run your application. Understood?
So it hello sir.
Uh-huh.
So it means that if we don't use enable auto configuration and we only use Spring Boot configuration,
Yes.
then we are not using Spring Boot's intelligence, right?
Yes, we are not using the, we are making Spring Boot as dummy, lazy.
Okay, thank you.
If you want to use the intelligence of the Spring Boot, we should have that annotation.
Sir, tomorrow class is same time?
Sir, one thing I want to update you. Tomorrow we don't have a class, sir. Our next class is on 15th.
Sir,